Hello and welcome back to Rock Records Reviewed. My name's Adam and this week we're going to take a look at the top 10 post-1970s Neil Young albums. We've looked at Neil Young before with a rundown of his albums before 1980, and now we're going to look at everything he's done since then, apart from the live albums. I think most people would agree that Neil Young made his legend with the work he did in the 70s. And the stuff he's done since then is an absolute minefield. If I was coming to it for the first time, I might go to one of these records, hear it, and just go, well, that's one of the worst things I've ever heard. Or if I go to the right records, I might think that's one of the best things I ever heard. It's that inconsistent and it's that diverse. There are some absolutely brilliant, essential Neil Young albums made after 1980. Don't let anyone tell you that there wasn't. But at the same time, you can't deny that there have been some very, very challenging records made in that period as well. Neil is just a force of nature as far as his muse is concerned. If he's feeling it and he has a point to make, he will do it and nothing will stop him. So he's made albums railing against all kinds of different things. But he's also made some very gentle, very sweet, very beautiful music in this time period. To give you a good example of just how challenging Neil's post-1980s output was, he signed with David Geffen, left his label Reprise and signed with David Geffen. And within a few years, David Geffen was suing Neil Young for making records that didn't sound like Neil Young. Which is one of those ridiculous rock and roll stories that you think someone must have made up, but it's absolutely true, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it as we go along. But look, let's get straight into it, and we're going straight into the controversy, because at number 10 I'm putting his 35th album from 2015, the Monsanto Years. Now, there are lots and lots of great Neil albums that could have vied for this 10th place, but I'm putting this one in because it's the first album he made with The Promise of the Real, which was a new band he'd put together with Willie Nelson's sons, and but also because it's an album railing against the Monsanto Corporation and their GM crops and all manner of different controversies that this company has invited over the years. And I just love the sound of a man of Neil's age being so angry and so diamond crystal clear in his artistic vision that he's going to make a record like this. I think it's joyous listening to the vitriol he has for these people. The band itself, they're a little bit lighter on their feet than Crazy Horse. I think that's fair to say. And musically they are a bit more dexterous, they're a little bit more deft, and I think there's some really good songs on this record. I really like Working Man is good, and I think If I Don't Know is one of his best tracks in years. And you've got a song like People Want to Hear About Love, which is a very familiar kind of theme with late period Neil stuff. The album, I saw the band on tour playing this album. I thought they were really good. I thought Promise of the Real did a fantastic job of playing not just the Crazy Horse numbers, but the Neil numbers as well. So at number 9 from 1995, Neil's 21st album, Mirabal. Neil made this album with Pearl Jam. He had been touring with them and they were huge Neil Young fans, and they found a date in the calendar and they went in and recorded this album within a month, but only over a space of 4 days. It's produced by Brendan O'Brien, who's done work with Bruce Springsteen, Bob Dylan, AC/DC, and the sound here is really, it's thick and it's strong, but it's also very loose and raw. A lot of it sounds like they're kind of jamming their way through a lot of the sections of the songs, which wouldn't be surprising, seeing as they wrote most of them within the 4 days that they actually recorded them as well. In fact, all but 2 of these songs were recorded at those sessions. There's a lot of spontaneity here. I'm the Ocean, Act of Love, Throw Your Hatred Down, really, really good songs. And you can hear that Pearl Jam are absolutely loving playing with one of their idols, and Neil does sound really rejuvenated. So it's a fun record, and one you can really turn up and put your foot down. Not too fast, but it's a good driving record. At number 8 from 1988, Neil's 16th album, This Note's For You. This was Neil's first album back with Reprise after he'd left Geffen after the whole kind of legal lawsuit that Geffen brought against him. And here, Neil had spent a lot of the 80s, the start of the 80s, experimenting stylistically. He'd made electronica records, he'd made a pure country record, he'd made a classic rock and roll record, and this is a swing blues album. It was recorded with a band he put together called the Blue Notes. In fact, he was sued because Harold Melvin, who originally had the Blue Notes back in the 50s, sued him. So it's now just known as a Neil Young album again. And there's a vague concept on this album about commercialism and the amount of money and music and that kind of stuff. The single itself, This Note's For You, actually featured a lookalike, Michael Jackson lookalike, getting his hair caught on fire while trying to do an advert. So, you could say that's in good or bad taste, but that's Neil being uncompromising. There's a lot of nice grooves on this album, some really, really great songs. Coupe de Ville, Can't Believe You're Lying, I really like. Twilight is really good. And then you've got some fun stuff. You've got Life in the City, Working Man, 10 Men Working, rather. It's very, very listenable. And it's oddly enough, it's one of the most un-Neil sounding records. But that was what Neil was doing in the 80s. And to give you an idea of just how dog-headed he was, David Geffen came to Neil after Neil had done a country album and electronica album. And he said, I just want you to sound like Neil Young. And Neil says, well, what does Neil Young sound like? And he says, I just want a rock and roll album again. And so Neil, being Neil, went into the studio and made a classic 50s sounding rock and roll album, in the most traditional sense of the word. And it just drove David Geffen absolutely mad. So, all the stylistic changing in the 80s, it was obviously where Neil's muse was. And sometimes it worked very well and sometimes it didn't. On This Note's For You, it worked well, I thought. Number 7 from 2000, Silver and Gold. Now, this is a sound of a man, I think, sitting back and taking stock and reflecting. It's full of beautiful, mellow acoustic songs. It's full of warmth. And I'll tell you what, with the lineup on this album, if you hadn't have made a good record, you might as well give up music. He had Donald Duck Dunn, Spooner Oldham, Ben Keith, Jim Keltner, Emmylou Harris, Linda Ronstadt. It's a dream lineup of musicians. It was nominated for Roots Album of the Year by Juno, the Canadian Music Awards. And it's easy to see why. It's got Silver and Gold on it, Horseshoe Man, Razor Love, which is one of my favourite Neil Young, late period Neil Young songs, and Buffalo Springfield Again, which is a very candid Neil look back on his time with Buffalo Springfield, and a very affectionate look back as well. I think this is a real modest gem in Neil's back catalogue, and if you ever want that really lovely, gentle, warm, mellow, acoustic Neil Young vibe, this is one of those albums you can go to. But completely different to that is number 6 from 1982, Trans, Neil's 12th album. Neil had been trying to communicate with his son Ben, who had cerebral palsy, and had been using all sorts of electronic equipment with which to do so. And this led him to looking into musical equipment, electronic equipment, and he came across the vocoder, which is one of those things that makes your voice sound like a robot. And he thought, right, this is for me, I'm going to make a record using this vocoder. And so this was his first album for Geffen. So Geffen had just spent a fortune signing Neil Young from Reprise, and the first thing that Neil decides to do is make a record where his voice sounds like a robot on it. So Geffen must have been tearing his hair out if he hadn't by that stage. I'm not sure he did. But Geffen had promised Neil total control and a guarantee of $1 million per album to sign for him. Originally, Neil actually did come to Geffen with an album called Island in the Sun, a concept album about sailing around the tropics and the Pacific. Geffen didn't think it was quite strong enough and said, could you just go back and maybe get me a couple of more killer songs? Well, instead of doing that, because no one tells Neil what to do. He decided to then get the vocoder out and augment the album with loads of songs where he about technology, about computers, about robots, all this kind of stuff. So the result is a real kind of hybrid record. You've got lovely sort of breezy, dreamy songs like an Inca and Little Thing Called Love, and then you've got songs like Sample and Hold, We're in Control, Computer Man, Transformer Man. It's very much those two albums glued together, and it left critics and fans really confused. And I think it was also kind of the start of Neil's journey into the wilderness commercially, if not artistically. Needless to say, David Geffen was furious, and it was the start of these. It was the harbinger of the legal wars that were to come. I really like the album, and I've always thought the songs on it were really actually very good, whether you had the vocoder or not. And interesting enough, when he made the Unplugged album a few years later, he took a few of the songs on this album with which he had a vocoder on and played them straight like normal songs, and their beauty was there for everyone to hear. But at number 5 from 1980, his 10th album, Hawks'n'Doves. So this album is a little bit of a cheat getting in here for two reasons. A, because it's 1980, so it gets in just under the cusp of the calendar. The other reason is the whole first side of this is taken from songs from sort of his mid-70s period. Now, Neil did this a lot. He would start an album and then he would shelve it. He wouldn't release it. He decided he didn't quite like something about it. And then he might go back to that album a few years later and cherry pick the best songs from that and put them on a new record. And this has happened many, many times in Neil's career. And the first side of Hawks'n'Doves is a really good example of that. It's a lovely acoustic side of music. It's got some beautiful songs on it. Captain Kennedy, Lost in Space, Little Wing, really, really beautiful song. And then side 2 is just a little bit more robust. You've got the grooves and the tunes on side 2. Staying Power, Union Man, Coming Apart at Every Nail. This is one of Neil's shortest albums. It's barely 30 minutes long, but I also think it's one of his most overlooked and underrated albums. Well worth investigating, especially if you want an album that really does just sort of tail off that golden period from the 70s. But number 4, his 19th album from 1992, Harvest Moon. Now this is Neil's most successful post-70s album by some distance. Neil had developed tinnitus after recording the Ragged Glory album, which we will talk about in a while. So he needed to get mellow. He needed to just lower the volume on everything. So he picked up his acoustic guitar, his banjo, all those kind of instruments, and he pulled in the Stray Gators, which is a band he's used over the years when he wanted to do this kind of music. They include Ben Keith, Tim Drummond, Spooner Oldham, traditional, old friends who have played with him when he wants that kind of sound. Jack Nietzsche, James Taylor, all involved, Linda Ronstadt. And the result is a really, really gorgeous album. It's recorded warmly on analog equipment, and it's most famous for the title track, Harvest Moon, which is beautiful, and I'm sure you'd recognise it. It's been used on a lot of TV shows, a lot of films. It's a lovely sort of elegant celebration of long-lasting love. It's also Unknown Legend is a great song from Hank to Hendrix, and they've there's even got Old King on there, which is a really silly song about his dog, which he plays on a banjo, which is great fun. The album was a huge success for Neil, and I think really one of his classiest records, a very, very easy record to like instantly. At number 3, though, from 1989, his 17th album, Freedom. Now, Freedom is a crucial album in the Neil Young canon because we've been talking about this wilderness he found himself in the 80s commercially, when he was doing all these different styles of music and people were getting confused and they didn't really know who Neil Young was anymore. Had he lost it? Did he still have it in him to make another great record? Well, not only did he still have it in him to make another great record, but on this record, he wrote his most iconic song, which is Rockin' in the Free World. And And that's no mean feat to do that on your 17th album. Can you think of any other artist who has made 17 albums and finally releases their most iconic song? Rockin' in the Free World begins and ends the album. It starts with an acoustic version. It finishes with a thunderously loud and heavy electric version, very similar to what Neil did with Hey Hey My Hey Hey on Rust Never Sleeps many years before. There's a lot of variety on this album. Stylistically, there's a lot of depth. You've got Chad Cromwell on drums and Rick Roswell on bass. It was Nico Bolas co-produced it with Neil. And there's some really good stuff on here. Don't Cry, El Dorado, which were both going to be on an EP called El Dorado, which was subsequently released later. Another of those Neil chopping up stuff and putting it out in different formats everywhere. Wrecking Ball, Someday, really. It also has Crime in the City, which is the real centerpiece of this record, and I think probably one of Neil's greatest late period songs. It sort of sounds, it's like you're watching a movie as you hear this song unfold with all these crazy scenes and scenarios that he beautifully describes to music. The sound on this album is really clean, but it's also very rich. It's there's a lot of space in it, which I really like. So it's undoubtedly kind of a late 80s album, but in a very good way. At number 2, though, from 1990, his 18th album, one we just mentioned, Ragged Glory. So he just released Freedom, and Neil was back on the map, and he was a player again, and people were interested. So what does he do? He makes the heaviest album of his career. This is a monster of a record. He made it with Crazy Horse in his Broken Arrow Ranch in California. It's loud and it's long, and this is really Neil as the guitar hero, improvising long extended solos and under those kind of hypnotic Crazy Horse grooves. Love and Only Love, over and over, Love to Burn, Country Home, White Lines. Every track on this album hits home and is a winner. It hits you in the stomach. It boxes you around the ears. This is garage rock. And I think I think this is the album that finally coronated Neil with the title of the Godfather of Grunge. It's one of the 1001 albums you must hear before you die. It was Rolling Stone's 77th best album of the 90s. But those kind of accolades don't do it justice. It's an album you really have to hear, and you have to, again, you've got to let it just wash over you, that sound. But because Neil was back on the map and he was going to make some noise. And it's a joyous noise to listen to when he's in full throttle like he is here. But my number one Neil post-70s album is from 1994, and it's his 20th album, and it's one he made again with Crazy Horse, and it's called Sleeps with Angels. This has an interesting backstory, this album. Kurt Cobain had just killed himself, and in his suicide note he had quoted Neil Young. He had said it's better to burn out than to fade away, which is a quote from My Hey Hey, the song we were talking about a second ago from Rust Never Sleeps. And this album is Neil's eulogy to Kurt Cobain. It's often overlooked by fans of the more sort of commercially successful Ragged Glory and Freedom and Harvest Moon, but this album is their equal and then some. It's far more experimental than any Crazy Horse album for many years, possibly since maybe after the Gold Rush. There's more variety here sonically. There's a much more texture here. You've got twinkling piano of something like My Heart. You've got the unsettling sort of falsetto harmonies of something like Sleeps with Angels. And then you've got out-and-out grunge rock with something as daft as Piece of Crap. It's a dark, moody, intense record. It owes much more to Tonight's the Night, actually. Tonight's the Night, probably, is the best comparison from Crazy Horse albums. Change Your Mind, Sleeps with Angels. I think it's one of those albums that's best listened to in a whole, not in a hole. Don't sit in a hole and listen to this album. I meant as a whole. One of those albums best listened to as a whole, where you can just let the mood and the atmosphere kind of just, you can get absorbed by it, because it is dark and it's broody and it's moody and it's brooding, not broody. He doesn't want a baby. But there's a menace, there's an undercurrent, an unsettling menace on this record, which I really really like, and that's extended to the cover artwork and the whole sort of package. So there you go. Those are my top 10 Neil Young post-70s albums. I would say that the top 4 here particularly are absolutely essential Neil Young albums. They completely stand alongside his best 70s work, and don't let anybody ever tell you they don't. There are some really, really good, interesting other Neil Young albums. I really like Greendale. I really, really like Peace Trail. I thought was a sweet record. Psychedelic Pill, probably his best record of recent years. Le Noise had some good songs. Reactor, I thought had some great songs. Old Ways was a really good country record. I mean, it's such a sort of mixed smorgasbord of music and styles and artistic visions. It's really very rewarding following Neil Young for so long and just going up and down with his muse. But admittedly, some records are not so good, and there are a few you might want to avoid. But it's not my place to say what those ones are. You can find them out for yourself. One record I would like to just pick out is Neil Young live at Massey Hall, which I think is one of the greatest live albums ever released. I didn't put it in my live albums list because it was released many, many years after he'd made it, and I wanted to make that list of records released in their own time. But Massey Hall is an absolutely beautiful record, crystal clear recording of Neil playing back in Canada just as he's about to break huge, and it's mesmerizingly good. So I recommend that as well. But I hope you've enjoyed the rundown. I'm sure you don't agree with me, so let's discuss it as we do in the comments below. But I will see you again very soon for another Rock Records review. Until then, thank you for watching. Bye bye.